This talk will be, I must admit, a talk that is not possessed of the lovely diagrams of the last one or two because I prepared it in about 20 minutes this morning. But still, I will try to tell you a little bit about the Anoma crypto economic system. Please interrupt me throughout with questions. Due to the limited preparation time, it is text heavy. So, this presentation consists roughly of three parts. The first is just motivating why we're interested in these questions at all, and what sort of conceptual frame we're using to think about the problem, which is pretty broad. Part two of the talk will propose a specific crypto economic system, which actually consists of three components. This is like a hierarchical fractal of threes style presentation. And the third part of the presentation, which also consists of three subcomponents, will be to talk about specific distribution options. So the motivating question here is, what is the Anoma token for? And there are, tokens can be for many things. They are instruments of social creation. They can be for whatever you decide that they're for and whatever you use them to do. But in particular, I think it's interesting to ask the question of what is the identity, apart from the name, apart from the sort of media ecosystem. If we split that part out, what does it really mean for two tokens to be different? What makes them different? Well, two tokens, again, apart from the name, A and B, if they have the same holders and the same economic flows, then I would argue they have the same economic dynamics. That is what identifies them. If you have the same holders and same flows, you might swap one out for the other, and whatever you did with one or do with the other, it would have the same effect, right? From the pure, again, the pure, not the media, but the pure economics perspective. So from this kind of lens, we approach the question of token design, treating tokens as mechanisms for economic regulation. This is not that new. Tokens and money have been used as mechanisms for economic regulation pretty much since they were invented. Now there are stories sometimes told in the research literature and even referenced in the Anoma vision paper about systems of barter leading to the introduction of currency in order to solve double coincidence of wants. This is bunk, pardon my French. And if you actually read the research literature, as we did, of course, after writing the vision paper, you will discover that it's merely a legend told by some economics professors and bears little relation to historical reality. So, nothing new under the sun, but now we have computers. And this makes things interesting because we can program these mechanisms for economic regulation in ways that were definitely not accessible in historical precedent. So, what does it take to make an economic regulation system work? At least at first, we're approaching this from the very high level perspective and taking as premise that the one thing economies or economic regulation systems must be able to do is adapt. What they must be able to do is change their dynamics. This is a very different position than most of crypto. Most monetary policy in crypto is static. It's like 21 million Bitcoin ever, or we will have some inflation for staking or something, but there's not even an attempt to capture some future potential change in what you would want the economic regulation to favor, disfavor, or otherwise do. Now, maybe an exception to this to some extent is Cosmos, which has some kinds of token holder governance, and some DAOs have taken this problem more seriously, but they're still often looking at it, they're looking at it from the perspective of, we might have proposals which will mint tokens or something like this, not necessarily thinking about different flows and what that means. So we've come up with a little bit of a different lens. So the key question in dynamics is just, how do the holders and flows change over time? How do we want to be able to change them in order to regulate something else, something that isn't the token, something that's kind of out in quote unquote the real world? Now, it might still be the world of bits and bytes or other things flowing around, but something that exists outside of the pure syntax of numbers and public keys. What do you need for this kind of economic regulation? In the initial Anoma crypto economic system, we sort of postulate that you need three essential things. The first thing is the ability to make commitments on different timelines. Making commitments entails giving up some kind of option, in particular the option to exit. So as we'll get to later when I talk about time variable staking, we've put a mechanism in the crypto economic system that allows stakeholders to lock up their tokens and say, I won't exit, I won't sell out of the system for some period of time as they choose. And these commitments are important because it's a kind of credible signal, because it gives other participants knowledge that these participants, can't extract something and then just leave tomorrow, right? So that's part one. Part two is regulation of flows, the ability to manage, let's say flows, if you think of just issuance of a token, where is it going, right? That's a flow. If my favorite punching bag, the US government issues some money and uses some of it to fund the F-67 now expected in 2067, and some other of it to fund, healthcare, those are some flows. And you get what you pay for. Whether or not that's real healthcare or real jet fighters, you're paying for it. So those are flows, and we want to perhaps do a better job, but more importantly, retain the ability to regulate them. And the final third thing that we also include in the first crypto economic system as a goal is the ability to regulate relationships with foreign economies as represented by foreign tokens. Both because we might have real economic relations with those economies that we want to be able to act in accordance with, maybe we're doing some kind of, you could think of it as some kind of trade or some kind of sharing of protocol development costs more concretely, and we want to have some kind of relationship of future mutual benefit there. And also because we might want to stabilize economies with respect to one another, as there can be many fluctuations which don't necessarily relate to the underlying system which we want to regulate. And just as, if you think of it from the perspective of trying to diversify a portfolio, or if you're growing plants in your backyard, you don't want to grow entirely one crop, because if some insect comes along and eats that crop, then that crop is all dead and you have nothing to eat, right? So resilience and thus predictability comes from the ability to regulate diverse relationships with foreign economies, foreign tokens, and predictability is necessary to plan to actually build anything, support economic development. So with those goals in mind, we put our mechanism designer hats on, and we cooked up something that we are currently calling, and we have too many acronyms, so maybe it would be good to come up with a different name, but we are currently calling the Anoma Crypto Economic System, sometimes shortened as ACES. So if you've seen the acronym ACES and wondered what it meant, it wasn't referring to a game of poker, it was referring to the Anoma Crypto Economic System. So let me just pause there and take any questions. That was all clear. Okay. So Anoma Crypto Economic System has three basic features which basically correspond to these three basic goals, right? So the first feature of the Anoma Crypto Economic System is something we call time variable staking. Now, staking can mean many things. The word doesn't have an exact consensus definition. Here, by staking, we just mean taking tokens and locking them up into a bond with some duration. This is very, very similar to like government treasuries or something in terms of the economic character, right? If you buy a US treasury, you give the government $1 now, and then you'll get $1.10 next year. We might or might not have the same interest rates, but the idea of variable lockup periods is basically identical. So time variable staking, that relates to the commitment part. Distribution stream governance, that relates to governing flows, directing different flows to different places with the ability for that to change over time. And then a metastability mechanism relates to regulation of relationships with foreign economies and stabilization of volatility and relative economic weight of things. So let's talk about these in more depth. First, time variable staking. With time variable staking, holders of XAN, or we could potentially call it something else, but for now, XAN, can lock their tokens up for a configurable period. It's possible for them to just choose this, unless we want to introduce some simplifications for user experience reasons, but the mechanism can support just configurable periods. And then there would be some kind of issuance similar to, treasuries or something like this, proportional to the amount of the bond and the lock duration. This is parameterized. So you'll see there's kind of the mechanism, and then there's some parameters. And the mechanism is just, it's mathematics, it's syntax. It has no specific, it doesn't make choices about, what the different numbers should be. It's just a mechanism. Then separately, there's the question of what the different numbers should be. And for now, we don't have exact answers to that, but we have built in the capacity to change them over time. So issuance proportional to bond amount and lock duration parameterized. Yep, as I said, kind of comparable to treasuries. Any questions on this part? Okay, distribution stream governance. So now here's where it gets more interesting. So in distribution stream governance, we start with just this concept of a funding stream. And a funding stream is nothing more and nothing less than a destination to which you send some tokens every, I don't know, like every block or every day, every some period. Funding streams could be, practically, they could be smart contracts on Ethereum or on other networks. They could be applications on Anoma in the future. They can have their own logic of their own. The only thing we need to be able to do in order to treat something as a funding stream is send XAN to it. And the idea behind this distribution stream governance mechanism is that we want to continually adjust the rates of these funding streams over time. So each epoch, epochs could be a day or something like this, bondholders can vote for a trinary, either up, down, or neutral for each stream. Now, it might be rather annoying to vote each day. In practice, many bondholders will probably program their votes either based on target numbers or based on delegation or based on other things. We leave that out of band of the mechanism design. It's something that people might configure in different ways, and it's sort of intentionally programmable. But each epoch, in whatever fashion, bondholders can vote up, down, or neutral, and then the up and down, or increase and decrease votes cancel each other out, and majority wins. So this approximates median voting over time. You can find an argument for how this works on the forums. But it's basically the same as if they voted for a number and then you picked the median. It's just that doing that is too computationally expensive, so we do the incremental version. And these funding streams can be anything, and they can also function in different ways. So one thing you might ask with this mechanism is, what if, governance wants to fund a particular project and it takes exactly n tokens or something. There's no way here to vote to, mint exactly n tokens. That's true, but you can vote to distribute to a funding stream which does nothing until it hits n, and then it distributes n to the project. So it's easy to recover that kind of sort of discrete functionality from continuous funding. Now, the basic assumption that this makes about the structure of what it is that you're trying to fund is that the funding streams are independent from each other, because you're voting on them independently. Now, that assumption is, safe if the funding streams are reasonably independent from each other, and unsafe or unworkable from a mechanism perspective if they're very dependent on each other. But we haven't said which funding streams are separate. So it's up to the users of the network to take the funding streams that are actually kind of dependent on each other, like where you would want to make correlated decisions on how much to fund them, and just combine them into a single funding stream. Yes, Yulia.
So how can these streams be independent? Is the supply unlimited, or is there no competition for funding between streams?
In the mechanism, the supply is unlimited.
Okay.
It would be possible to, if for other reasons people wanted predictability of high-level sort of monetary policy, which can be a reasonable request, one could impose supply limitations that would then indeed make this more complex, because there would be contention. But maybe you just keep those above enough that in practice it doesn't apply most of the time.
I don't fully understand how it works, but if it's unlimited and there is no competition between the streams, what is the value of the funding? Why not to fund just all of the streams?
I see. Well, it is, in some sense, let's suppose that this economy is producing something, for sake of argument, I don't know, space and Anoma blocks or other things that people want to use, and there's some amount of demand for that, and that gets funneled into the token through usage. The resulting, if we mint infinite numbers of tokens, of course, the resulting economics aren't sustainable. So there is contention in that sense. It's just not in the voting mechanism, if you know what I mean. Like there's contention in the sense of if you issue more tokens, then as a fraction of ownership, each token is less of the whole.
How do you ensure there is no limitations in voting while there is limitation in funding, if they're directly related?
They're probably indirectly related in the sense that this is averaged out over time. Like if you have fluctuating demand, that might make relative prices of things, again, sort of external to the specific token, go up and down, and then that could, suppose that some issuance stream in Zan is being received by an organization which sells it to buy dollars to fund some particular kind of production, right? So their ability to do that would indeed fluctuate if there are a lot of tokens printed here or whatever. That's true, but it doesn't, the idea is that these will change relatively slowly, so this should be predictable enough, and the metastability mechanism can also help balance out some amount of fluctuations over time. So, I mean, I guess my summary answer is like the mechanism is designed not to introduce additional contention, other than the contention that exists due to, of course, underlying resources. But the resources kind of live outside this system. Like if maybe there aren't you could use the system without real resources, and you're just kind of like you're assigning points to things. I don't know. You have an infinite number of points. There's no...
But the actors that are voting, they're real actors, right? So don't they do the mapping in their brain, even if we abstract away the actual resources, they just map the resources to the points they assign, and then they kind of do the math and...
For sure. I mean, and that's why you would, why would you vote down a funding stream? Well, you would vote down a funding stream if you think the value of the thing that it's funding is not sufficient to merit the current issuance. But what the assumption that's embedded here is that those assessments of value of what it's funding are sufficiently independent that you don't have to make decisions about funding streams in conjunction. Tobias.
Thank you for all the ideas. This is an old question that is popping up again in my brain from the last round here, from the last bullet, sorry, not the last round. Votes are weighted by bond amount. And I could have a funding stream to people that are voting, right?
Yes.
So what is the remedy against people that are already rich to become richer again? Because they just vote up their stream and vote down all other streams?
Intrinsic in this mechanism, nothing. Now, people who have bonds, large bonds that are locked for a long time are, in a sense, exposed to or tied to the reputation of the system as a whole, because they can't get rid of their tokens immediately. So they can't just vote for their funding stream and take their funding stream and sell it and go away. Now, if you had, it depends a little bit on the relative numbers, like if, in one day you mint more tokens than all of the current bond amounts, then probably that kind of attack is very appealing. But it does still require, it requires a 1/3 majority to execute it if you're a single actor. Whereas if you have relatively low issuance in relation to the total supply over time, then the reputational cost might be much higher than what you could gain from doing this.
So what I get away from that is my takeaway then, basically by tweaking parameters, and maybe then the chances of that are relatively mild.
I mean, I think a very honest answer to that is that it kind of depends on the surrounding social system and media ecosystem. This is not a media ecosystem, it's a crypto economic mechanism. And if in your media ecosystem, there's not a very good way to track who's telling the truth or lying or getting bribed or not, then there's kind of, in my view, there's basically nothing that we can do on the mechanism design angle to fix it. And it's better to just make it clear what the dependencies are. But at least there's a lockup mechanism. So it's not like you have 1,000 tokens, you vote 1,000 to you, and then you go away. And the variable locks, maybe add some protection here. Patrick.
Would it be fair to say that this this system is not dissimilar to something like Curve in terms of the lockups and the governance rights?
I think the lockup and governance right bit is somewhat similar to Curve. I think at least the kinds of examples I'll give later for what this might be used to fund are very different.
So my question's a little bit leading. It's along the lines of Tobias's question. Obviously, this is a mechanism. It's not an implementation. So and the point of this talk is not about implementation, so I'm speculating a little bit here, but would you anticipate that somebody would build basically another governance system on top of this whereby you could delegate your locked bonds or rights to them for this other protocol, and this other protocol would potentially issue you rewards, and then this other protocol now owns basically the governance system? This would be like convex on top of curve.
I do think that it's possible, yes. And even, what the technical support for wherever it was, technical support for some kind of vote delegation is also the same thing needed to enable this. And this is, we could make it easier or harder to build, but it will be possible either way. To some extent, I think levels of delegated governance is kind of unavoidable. That's just how functional social systems work. They don't work by direct democracy on everything, although it's often nice to have direct democracy as a last recourse. And in this system you do, or at least the bondholders do. Yeah, I don't know. If your question is like, what's reasonable to expect, I think that's not a question that can be answered purely on the basis of the mechanism design. One thing that is very different than Curve is that this issuance, at least for the most part, is not related to funding liquidity positions. Maybe a little bit in the metastability mechanism, but the examples I'll talk about here are of different things. And presumably that would, what the voting is related to would change the kinds of secondary governance mechanisms that people would want to build on top of it.
Do you think that there's actually some positive feedback loops there of people building mechanisms on top of this mechanism?
Yes, I think that can be very positive because, if you actually want functional economic regulation, you want some level of consistency, and at most, the thing you really need is like people or institutions analyzing the options that have time and the ability to commit resources to actually doing research about what decision is right? And this is when you try to make everyone pay that cost in pure direct democracy, it doesn't work very well. So I think that levels of delegation on top of this could be quite positive. But yeah, it depends on what happens. You also asked, could another system just capture this if it becomes, very dominant? Yeah, I think that's possible. It has maybe the same, not quite exactly the same, but maybe the same downside as like people being bribed. If you have really long locks, you want the thing to work for a while. So you have at least some reason to try and make that happen and not sell out to something else, but, it depends.
It's probably a good problem to have anyway.
Okay, I want to move on. Let's talk about the metastability mechanism. So that's the third part corresponding to the third goal, which is regulation of relationships with foreign economies. So in the metastability mechanism, we have a few basic components. This is probably the most complex of the three here. One is a foreign reserve account, which is just like an account. You could think of it as controlled by XAN or the stakeholder governance function that holds other tokens. It could be Ethereum or Bitcoin or USDC or something else. And that account holds protocol-owned liquidity, which means that it has liquidity positions as you would find in something like Uniswap or maybe in the future HyperCow, that is managed. And it's managed with, we can use various algorithms, but it's managed based on targets and in general, some volatility dampening parameters which are chosen to convert short-term volatility to long-term stability. So phrased in different terms, here the system itself is acting as a market maker. It is, let's say, offering to buy Zan at $5 and sell it at 20. And if anyone wants to sell Zan at $5, they can sell it to the protocol. And if anyone wants to buy it at 20, they can buy it from the protocol, right? Yeah, crazy spread. But, just as an example. And if we assume that if you think, unfortunately, I don't have graphs, but if you think of some graphs and assume that there's some fluctuation here, what this does is that A, it damps the volatility a little bit, and B, in offering this liquidity, of course, the protocol can take some fees, which means if there's a lot of fluctuation, like, I don't know, just think of a sine wave or some random process, then over time, the foreign reserve account will hold more and more of these tokens that are being traded, such as USDC and XAN. Just as an example, and this allows for the conversion of some of this short-term volatility into long-term stability. That long-term stability is achieved in part just through this protocol-owned liquidity, and in part through the collection of some of these fees or other tokens in what we call a backing reserve, which is an account that can offer zero-interest loans to bondholders. This is not actively managed liquidity. It's just like over time, the protocol collects some USDC, and then if you hold a bond, you can take a zero-interest loan out against the asset reserve the backing reserve held by the protocol in USDC, do something so you can meet some liquidity obligations, and then pay it back later. And the reason this has the effect of metastability is that, well, if, I don't know, the ZAN price goes down a lot as measured in USDC, you can always get at least this much. Right? If there are 1 million ZAN and 1 million USDC in the backing reserve, you can always get at least one, because those are the assets that the protocol itself holds. So it establishes, in some sense, this floor. Any questions there?
So in terms of the backing, if let's say on wherever the venue is where the price discovery is happening for XAN, let's say it's not on wherever this is implemented, Anoma on Ethereum. Let's say it's on a centralized exchange. Let's say the current centralized exchange price is at, I don't know, $5 trading, and it's looking like it's going, to $1 or 0 or something, but the value of the assets in the reserve would suggest that the price should actually be $20. Would I be able then to redeem at $20 from this reserve, even though the price on the centralized exchange is $5? Like, how long would it be before that arbitrage closes?
That depends on external markets. But if you have one XAN in this scenario, you can lock it up in a bond, and then you can withdraw proportionally assets from the backing reserve in a zero-interest loan. So you can lock up your 1 XAN in a bond and just get $20. If you don't want to do that, then this mechanism won't help you, but you don't have to go to the exchange.
So in a certain sense, this can put a floor on the price.
Yes, in an efficient market where there are arbitrageurs, someone else could also buy your ZAN for $5 on the exchange, and then they could get $20. So one has a reason to expect these things to match.
Do you anticipate that this mechanism would make it such that it is the primary venue where price discovery happens for XAN versus external assets? This is often not the case, right? It's usually Binance, which is where the price discovery happens. But if this happens on chain, this actually would be quite novel and different than any other asset I can think of, with the exception of a few new ones like Hype or something like this.
I don't know. I think that depends on details which are not really fixed in this presentation. For example, it depends on the tightness of the spreads that are offered by the metastability mechanism. If it's $5 and $20, it's not going to be the primary price discovery venue. On the other hand, if the metastability mechanism tries to offer very tight spreads, or is paired with a product like HyperCow, maybe, it doesn't, there are trade-offs to these things, actually, not only from the perspective of products, but also just if we offer a very tight spread and large volume, then the protocol may end up on the wrong side of that trade, right? Like, that may not be what we want in terms of economic regulation from the perspective of the protocol. So, that's a good sort of open question, I would say.
My last question, I don't mean to dominate here, is Do you anticipate that this mechanism could actually help deepen the relationships between different protocols that Anoma might interact with, i.e. Nemata or Ethereum or even Bitcoin or something like this?
Yes, and well, that is certainly, I will caveat, that is certainly a design goal from our end. I think in practice, deepening those relationships in serious economic ways requires reciprocity. And are the Bitcoin holders going to increase their 20 million supply cap and start sending Bitcoin to Anoma? I mean, we can dream. They're going to have to increase it anyway because Bitcoin's fee model is broken, in case you're not paying attention. But, you know, to be determined. I mean, we've analyzed a little bit the case of sort of symmetric, like multiple metastability mechanisms. That you could have, for example, distribution streams that issue tokens to another party's treasury, and then vice versa, or even distribution streams to some kind of smart contract where if you both distribute to it, releases the tokens to each other. So kind of trustless, even though your governance is operating on different timescales. And I think that that's really interesting to change the sort of practical monetary structure of the crypto markets long term. But it also requires the adoption of this thing by a lot of other people. And it's a very, I mean, from the monetary policy perspective, it's very different than most, you know, the current, I guess, predominant approach.
So to go to the foreign tokens and the metastability. So as far as I understand, there is no restriction on which other tokens that could be.
Yes. Not at the mechanism level.
Right. So basically there's like, we don't want any toxic tokens, basically, in short. That's the thinking, the quick thinking. In longer terms, like, how do we have like a certain like rating of tokens that kind of move from like a D level to higher levels, so that there's like a core, and like basically I want to have a layered version of this. So right now we just have like native and other tokens. So we could have like native and those that we already believe in, and those that we've heard about, and those that have never been seen, and those that we really don't care about, and anything else we don't
Sounds
talk
like
about.
the hierarchical mempools talk but applied to tokens.
Well, maybe I have a little bit of a professional deformation there, but well, is that something that you have been thinking about, or are there examples of such a thing where you have essentially ratings of different currencies that you might want to take into account, so that basically you don't spoil the whole thing just by getting like one stupid meme coin?
I see. I mean, yes. So it's really, the details are elided in this slide, but this mechanism involves specific targets for different currencies. And those are set by distribution stream governance or by a similar voting mechanism. So it's not just arbitrary tokens. The tokens are chosen. And you can choose what level of liquidity you want to hold for each token and at which points. The mechanism, if you squint a bit, it's not dissimilar to central banks holding foreign fiat currencies and offering swap lines or providing liquidity, to ensure stability, or even, I mean, central banks also do things like try to keep their currency low to make exports competitive. I don't know if the Anoma economy is going to relate to managing industrial exports anytime soon, but if it did, you could use this mechanism to do that. It's kind of the same structure. Questions? Other questions? Okay. All right. How am I doing on time? Done. Okay. Then let's skip to the end here. Thank you for all the lovely questions. This part is less important, and I will talk about it later. I'm just going to talk really quickly about 3 possible distribution stream options, just to give you a flavor for what that would look like. The first is some kind of prize-based public goods funding. So this is an example of what I was talking about earlier, where you might actually want to fund discrete things, and you can do that with continuous streams. You just fund a prize for a while until it grows to a certain level. And then that prize can be committed up front to whoever manages an intersubjectively verifiable task in the future. So like landing a probe on Mars, an example of something that's relatively expensive to fake. Most would believe. And other agents, such as venture capitalists or whatever, could fund early stage projects which compete for this prize with some kind of agreement to share the rewards if they win. This idea is not new. It's been discussed under various flavors of RBGF for a long time. But at least in crypto so far, we haven't really seen like this kind of prize-based advance commitment. Examples in recent history include the Ansari X Prize, which worked like this. Stripe Climate did some advanced market commitments to purchase carbon offsets, which is not exactly the same thing, but it's similar, etc. That's one thing. Another thing, proof of work. You might have heard of proof of work as a consensus mechanism. Proof of work is not a consensus mechanism. That's just propaganda. The consensus mechanism is Nakamoto consensus, and proof of work is a way to just a mathematically hard puzzle that typically does nothing useful. But we can create some issuance for proof of work here to incentivize optimizing a particular function that is useful, like ZK proving. And thanks to just having control over it as an incentive scheme, this isn't going to cause a lot of extra energy usage or something like this, because we can just pay a little bit of issuance and proof of work for a while until we get the optimization level in hardware and software we want, and then we're done, right? No one actually wants Bitcoin ASICs apart from Bitcoin mining. They aren't socially useful. Shelling tests, this one you might need to go to the forums, but this is the kind of direction of WorldCoin, but not dystopian. Instead, using graphs and semantic attestations, such as person Y believes that public key X corresponds to a real human, performing tests on these graphs to answer questions like, does public key X uniquely correspond to a human? And then maybe distributing tokens to keys that match tests. This idea is a little bit speculative, but I was recently reassured by reading basically the exact same thing proposed in a paper by Ehud Shapiro independently. So that's great, and I think that there's some meat here, metaphorically speaking, if you eat vegan noodles. Okay, quick recap. The purpose of the Anoma token is the regulation of the Anoma economy. ACES is the initial mechanism that I'm proposing here, including time variable staking, distribution stream voting, and the metastability mechanism. This all we plan to deploy on Anoma v1, at least at the moment. You can find details in the ACES product requirements on the forums. And distribution stream voting allows for a great diversity of flow options, including many more, that I haven't mentioned here. Thank you.